We are following what now resembles an ongoing slow-motion train wreck. That is Pete Hegseth's last-ditch effort to be confirmed by the United States Senate as Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense. We should tell you it is a fluid situation. If any news breaks or changes while we're on the air over the next 2 hours, we'll bring it to you at any point. For now, though, the scandal-ridden former Fox News weekend morning show host has been trying on Capitol Hill to persuade Senate Republicans that he is the man for the job. It is now a formidable undertaking, given the NBC News reporting we broke here on this program less than 24 hours ago, reporting that said that, quote, as many as 6 Senate Republicans, perhaps more, are currently not comfortable supporting Hegseth's bid to lead the Pentagon as new revelations about his past continue to be made public. It would appear Hegseth is undaunted by that report and plowing ahead with what now resembles a bit of a Hail Mary. With Hegseth writing in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this, quote, I have never backed down from a fight and won't back down from this one. Complicating things, however, for Hegseth is the fact that Donald Trump seems to have moved on. He's reportedly discussing replacing Hegseth with Florida governor and former Trump nemesis Ron DeSantis. Trump has reportedly been, quote, floating DeSantis' name in casual conversations with guests at Mar-a-Lago. Mark Caputo at The Bulwark reports that Trump and DeSantis, quote, have personally discussed the possibility. And this, quote, the talks relayed by 4 sources briefed on them are in their advanced stages. And you know, you had to make the rounds on Capitol Hill knowing that Trump is in the advanced stages of replacing you with somebody else. Maybe you would consider a media blitz with a friendly former Fox News anchor like Megyn Kelly, too. Listen to him with her trying to clean up the other piece of reporting that dropped 24 hours ago. The NBC News exclusive that 10 current and former Fox employees say Hegseth drank in ways that, quote, concerned them. That, quote, on more than a dozen occasions, they smelled alcohol on him before he went on the air. That this troubling behavior happened, quote, as recently as last month. And that, quote, his drinking remained a concern until Trump announced him as his choice to run the Pentagon, end quote. Not sure how you even begin to do damage control about that, but he gave it a go with Megyn Kelly today.
You are not allowed to drink while you're on deployment, right? So if you're in Iraq and Afghanistan in a combat zone, you're not allowed to drink. That's how I view this role as Secretary of Defense, is that I'm not going to have a drink at all. And it's not hard for me because it's not a problem for me. This is the biggest deployment of my life, and there won't be a drop of alcohol on my lips while I'm doing it. First of all, I've never had a drinking problem. No one's ever approached me and said, oh, you should really look at getting help for a drink. Never. I've never sought counseling, never sought help. I respect and appreciate people who do.
The things some of his former and current colleagues at Fox are saying to reporters that may or may not be reality. It is, though, where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. With me at the table, New York Times editorial board member and MSNBC political analyst Mark Gay. Also joining us in a second, tangled up in some Midtown traffic, Paul Rieckhoff will be here. But joining our conversation as well is political strategist and MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd. Matt Dowd, I start with you because this has become, and I should say, the reporting that broke 24 hours ago from my colleagues at NBC News, I think between the 2 stories, 14 sources, all of them deep within Hegseth circles. There are no Democrats who are saying things that they aren't saying in full view, but the people speaking anonymously are people who have had to get Pete Hegseth on the air while he smells like alcohol. They're people who describe how stressful it is to simply get a morning news show on the air. And I'm a cable host. No one lives or dies whether I'm on the air, but not so with the Secretary of Defense. And what sounds like a president in Donald Trump who's so transactional that he's moved on to option number 2, which we can talk about DeSantis in a moment. But it would be clear that the only person for whom the gravitational pull of this not working out isn't really abundantly clear is Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Nicole, and I hope your holidays were great. Yeah, as I listen to this and watch this, I think anybody with a rational mind would have known when Pete Hegseth got nominated, he had a sell-by date. And I mean, just because of his background, just because of all the things you could track, he said, just because of things that were very common knowledge to most people, you would know that this guy's not going to last long, which is actually the surprising thing about this initial nomination was if you knew that, and I think Donald Trump probably knew that, he had to have known that, is that why you would nominate him this early and have a drawn-out examination of him. That's what amazes me, that it would be 2 months or more before he actually got a hearing. If you had known that about him, if you'd known somebody had a sell-by date, what you would want to do is nominate them like right after you become president and push the Senate to confirm him as quickly as possible and get through this before he sours. And that's not what Donald Trump chose to do. And so, this is now, it hasn't happened yet, but it will, if it looks like it will be the third nominee before we even get to the opening of Congress that is jettisoned at this point. And it's not, as you said, it's not because of any Democrat. All of these are because Republicans have we've identified at least some line in the sand where they draw on people in the course of this. And I'll just say on a personal level, that explanation that he had about drinking, which I think actually is put Trump over the top in wanting to go to somewhere else, in my view. It's not the sexual assault stuff. It's not all the crazy stuff he said in his books. It's not all this outlandish stuff he said on air. It was the drinking, because we've known if there's one thing Donald Trump has personally talked about, is that what happened with his brother and the drinking. And I just don't think Donald Trump tolerates it. It's one thing Donald Trump, he'll tolerate corruption, he'll tolerate sexual assault, he'll tolerate all these things, but he doesn't tolerate drinking. And so when I heard that, I thought, okay, that's the end of it. But that his explanation is, and people that like me or others who have dealt with people in our families or friends that have had a drinking problem, they all say exactly what Pete said. No one's ever told me, I've never gone to counseling, I don't have a drinking problem, until they get the DWI or until they get in the car crash. And what I'm hoping happens is this is Pete Hegseth's car crash or DWI, that, he actually is able to, go through a 12-step process, and the first thing he identifies is, I have a problem, I need to deal with it. But his explanation, anybody that's dealt with anybody or has gone through a problem with alcoholism, watched his words, and they've heard those same words over and over and over again. Until you hit a bottom somewhere, you're going to say exactly what he says. I don't have a problem, and nobody's ever told me I had a problem, until you end up in a jail cell, until you end up in a car crash.
Matt Dowd has brought this down to the human level, which is Matt Dowd's special gift. And at a human level, there's something, it is our job to cover these institutions and to give voice to people who can't speak out, right? The men and women of the military can't speak out. They can't go on Fox News. They can't go anywhere and weigh in on politics. But in the interest of the men and women of the military, having someone qualified and stable and viewed by their peers, whether they're at a nonprofit or whether they're at a news network, as capable is news. And covering a human being and the kinds of things that human beings' own mother said about them. I will not play the interview of Pete Hegseth's mother on Fox News, because there's something of a hostage tape feeling to me. I can't watch it without feeling so uncomfortable that this family is in this position. But it goes to something Matt Dowd said. There are human beings who are thrust upon the American public in the time of Donald Trump, who can't withstand the scrutiny because Donald Trump is so thoughtless in the picks he makes. And I'm just struck today by how unnecessary all of this is. That Trump won, he can appoint whoever he wants to any of these jobs. But the FU to the vetting and to the background checks and to the system of his own transit. I mean, Gates and Hegseth are born from Trump's own refusal to abide by his own sort of cockamamie orbits systems. That's how we got here.
Totally. I mean, Nicole, I'm also glad that you're not playing that video of his mother, because there is just part of you as a human. You can't help but watch this spectacle and just feel sorry for Pete
For all of them.
Hegseth and for his entire family. And of course, that is not what this is about. And I think it's really important that we remember that the reason he's under such scrutiny is because the president-elect who nominated him, as you said, has no regard for American institutions or for the military. And if he did, he would have taken this vetting process very seriously before thrusting someone like Pete Hegseth and his entire family and history and all of his exes, anybody who has come into contact with him into the spotlight for America to pick apart. And that doesn't look responsible. I think you have to also be asking, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about this here at the table today, what this means to members of the military. I mean, many of my friends who I grew up with served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are veterans. And I've spoken to them in recent days. They are looking at this and thinking, this man's going to lead us? I mean, I don't think so. Is he even going? I mean, this is really not appropriate. So it's really disrespectful. But I am heartened that these senators who are Republicans have made clear they will not be a rubber stamp. And, they've received security briefings. So let's remember that. They've got to be thinking, this isn't a reality show, actually. At the end of the day, we're talking about who's going to lead the military, domestic threats, foreign threats. This is serious business. They understand that. And I think, Donald Trump is being reminded by them that he might be feeling good politically, but he's not walking into the White House with carte blanche. There are other branches of government. And this is a good sign, I think.
President-elect Trump has quickly been naming people to the administration, 2 embattled nominees already withdrawing after scandals, and signs they might fail Senate confirmation, the 2 you see there. Other jobs can be filled without a Senate vote. Today, Donald Trump tapped a convict for his White House, rehiring Peter Navarro as White House trade advisor. That's after Navarro served time for defying the January 6th probe. Navarro's made headlines for his efforts to help overthrow Trump's 2020 loss. You can see some of the headlines, both recent and past, from when I pressed him about that plot on this program. He admitted efforts to try to overthrow Trump's loss through the Congress, what he called a sweep. And these plots, you should remember, were initially underreported. They were not charged in those first few months after January 6th. But they formed this broader multi-pronged coup strategy, which was ultimately indicted by both state and federal prosecutors. Now, Navarro's answers supplied new evidence at the time. The January 6th committee subpoenaed him to testify only after that interview. He refused to testify. Congress ultimately recommended he be charged for that refusal, which led to his trial and conviction. And Trump rewarded that convicted defiance with a spot speaking at the GOP convention and now today's appointment.
The plan was simply this. We had over 100 congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill ready to implement the sweep.
Do you realize you are describing a coup?
No.
At the same time he was refusing to comply with our subpoena, Mr. Navarro made multiple media appearances during which he discussed his various roles in the events that culminated in the January 6th attack. I'd like to play a media clip right now.
I have so much knowledge to share with you about what I was involved in and what I know.
He has so much knowledge to share with a journalist, but he refuses to share that knowledge in response to a lawful subpoena.
They put me in handcuffs, they bring me here, they put me in leg irons, they stick me in a cell. If they can come for me, and if they can come for Donald Trump, be careful, they will come for you. I was convicted for simply refusing to testify before Congress. You implicated me in some kind of crime with Donald Trump. He's been loyal to me.
Donald Trump's been loyal to him, said Navarro, but loyal for what? Peter Navarro was blunt about exactly that exchange when we spoke to him after his time serving prison time. Trump has pardoned other aides who clashed with prosecutors rather than tell the truth under oath about just what they all did in government, what they did together. Navarro's appointment new today is the latest indication that Donald Trump will continue to take any actions he can, both through the power he has in hiring and perhaps the power he has in pardoning, to protect whatever secrets they have from the past and presumably whatever else they want to do in the future. I'm joined by former FBI General Counsel and former Mueller prosecutor Andrew Weissmann. Welcome back.
Nice to be here.
You see that history, and through the hiring and perhaps through future pardons, it seems to reward something that was always antithetical to law and order, which was defying a lawful subpoena and a probe.
So it's really worth remembering that the president-elect is a felon. He has been convicted of 34 felonies. These are just facts.
Yeah.
You can look at the first Trump presidency where he used the pardon power to pardon a series of criminals who were loyal to him, not just sort of general issues about pardon power abuse, but you can look at Manafort, Stone, other people who did not cooperate with the Mueller investigation. Basically, every defendant who we convicted, either at a trial or because they pled guilty, was pardoned. The people who cooperated were not pardoned. That is antithetical to law enforcement. So one shouldn't be surprised that for some of the nominees that you're seeing a recapitulation of exactly what we saw the first time, but with sort of shamelessness. That you have somebody like Peter Navarro, that you have Steve Bannon, other people who are either convicted or people who have been under investigation like Matt Gaetz, who are part of the Klan for Donald Trump.
Here he was talking briefly on one of the programs, War Room, which is what Steve Bannon runs, and he was the other person who also took prison time for defying the probe,
yep.
About personnel and policy and how they view all this. Take a look.
Personnel is policy. This goes back to Reagan. Bad personnel is not just bad policy, but it's bad politics. And one of the problems we had in that first term was just having a lot of deadwood in there who would slow down the Trump agenda because they thought they were better than they thought they got elected.
Yeah.
These are people now coming back in. Bannon still is awaiting a New York trial, so he's essentially tied up in that sense, legally presumed innocent there, and we'll see what happens in that case.
Right.
But what does this do to the environment in the White House, where not only is there the history you just cited, but you have people around who, yes, you can say they've paid their debt to society. That's how the system works. But the entire attitude is anti-law, anti-law enforcement, anti-cooperation with these obligations, while they are, in some sense, part of the branch that is supposed to, as it says in their oath, take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Well, I think big picture, you can look at some of the proposed nominees as really running on what Steve Bannon has sort of coined as burn it all down. They're not just people who are not qualified. They're people who are running and being proposed to run an agency, and they're antithetical to that agency itself. RFK Jr., primary example, with severe, real health risks to the entire country, if not the world, based on that nomination alone. That's just within healthcare. You can say the same thing, though, for the Justice Department. Kash Patel would be, in my view, a prime example of posing that kind of risk. You don't put people who have either are criminals or completely incompetent in charge of the national security and law enforcement apparatus of this country. And I'm going to borrow a comment from Tim Miller, which is, if this is what it takes for the country to sort of wake up, that's the road we might be on, where sort of the burn it all down makes people realize that, bureaucracies are flawed, but it's better to have some kind of functioning government than to live in complete chaos.
Right, and we're all going to cover and live through this and see what happens. I want to play one more moment from that original interview because he was quite stark about what they intended to do when they lost.
Have the battleground states challenge the results That would trigger 24 hours of hearings. Mike Pence's job at that point was to take 10 days and go back and give the state legislatures, who really are the ones who have the power to determine whether an election is fraudulent, to give them a second look.
This was the government side of the coup and sort of creating reality, trying to commit voter elector fraud in other ways and then just claim power. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but how do you view this if those are now the people back in the White House with future elections?
Well, one of the things is what you had him say, and I mean, he volunteered it. It's his sort of like, you didn't force him to make these kinds of damning admissions, is the way that prosecutors make cases and the way they prove up something is by having people who are, especially people who used to be in government, tell the truth about what happened. So he's saying, I have all this information that he was unwilling to give it to Congress. That's an obligation that we all have, absent a lawful privilege. He did not have a lawful privilege. And now having somebody in the government having that view, which is that you just don't have to abide by the law, to me, it's of a piece with, as I said, the president-elect himself. I mean,
right,
you have to remember, he is a convicted felon. So the idea that we shouldn't be surprised that some of the proposed people have that same background.
Right now, Pete Hegseth is back on the Hill, where in the face of even more misconduct accusations, support is waning. NBC reports at least half a dozen Republican senators are not comfortable with Hegseth leading the Pentagon. And we also have new exclusive reporting, several current and former Fox News staffers telling NBC News his drinking habits during his time there worried colleagues. Hegseth denies all wrongdoing. But we've learned Trump is already mulling potential replacements for the defense secretary job. Two sources telling us Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is one contender. With Hegseth's bid on the ropes, his mother is now coming to his defense. Penelope Hegseth became part of the story when the New York Times published an email she sent years ago accusing her son of mistreating women. And she has since disavowed those sentiments, has apologized for sending the email, and she defended her son on Fox just this morning.
Pete is a new person. He's redeemed, forgiven, changed. I think we all are after 7 years. I believe he's the man for the job. I think being a TV news host, I think prepares you for most things in a position like this. He doesn't misuse women. No. I mean, he's been through some difficult things. I'm not going to list them by name, but I would just say that some of those attachments or descriptions are just not true.
When asked if she would testify to this for any confirmation hearings, she would not commit. We have NBC News correspondents covering this from all angles today. Vaughn Hilliard joins us in West Palm Beach, Courtney Kube at the Pentagon, and Ali Vitale at the Capitol. Also with us, Susan Glasser from The New Yorker. Courtney, Pete Hegseth's Pentagon bid in limbo, and you're reporting Trump's now considering Ron DeSantis for the role, but also a few other names. What are you learning?
Yeah, that's right. So among Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who, of course, has a military background, he was a JAG, an attorney in the military, and he has experience running a government, running the state of Florida as governor. So definitely has more experience than the current selection, Pete Hegseth, who also served in the military and mainly in the National Guard, but really hasn't had any experience in government or running a large organization. Certainly nothing anywhere near the scale and scope of the Department of Defense. But in addition to Governor DeSantis, we've also heard a couple other names who are still possibles for if, in fact, Pete Hegseth withdraws or is withdrawn from this job. That includes Iowa Republican Senator Joni Ernst, also with military experience and, of course, experience in the Senate and with the armed services. She's been pretty outspoken about advocating for women in the military specifically. So she has been someone we've been watching to see if she is against Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary's selection because of his very outspoken comments about how women should no longer serve in combat positions in the military. In addition to that, a sort of surprising possibility for the job to replace Pete Hegseth as the Defense Secretary nominee is Florida Congressman Republican Mike Waltz. Of course, President-elect Donald Trump selected him as his national security advisor pick. So this would be a quick move before even actually technically being in the White House over to another choice. But again, everyone is watching today as Pete Hegseth is back on the Hill meeting with senators to see if he's able to change any of these no's to a maybe or even to a yes. At least 6 Republican senators now are expressing concern about his nomination. And it's not just the experience I mentioned, but the many character accusations that have seemed to come out, frankly, on a daily basis at this point about Hegseth. Anna.
The only good thing about being in the swamp is you get to sit in the dojo that Steve Bannon built. And that's where I'm operating right now in my Trumpomania T-shirt, because that's what it's all about.
That is Kash Patel. That's the man Donald Trump nominated to run the FBI. He's never worked for the FBI, but he does host Steve Bannon's War Room podcast a lot, where he loves to share conspiracy theories.
The Chinese, the CCP, helped fund portions of the Biden campaign.
Get the sergeant at arms to go out and arrest Merrick Garland.
They want everything in every way to rig this system, just like the censorship regime.
We're going back to Wuhan, we're going back to COVID origins, and we're going back to another form of a mega virus that can take out China's enemies.
They're in on it with the mainstream media, the Biden-Harris-Waltz campaign, and, of course, the FBI.
Like so many guys in Trump world, Patel just can't stop talking, which, game recognized game. These folks are mostly made of podcasts at this point, and from the little I've heard, what he's been saying is pretty out there. Joining me now is someone who has spent a lot of time listening to those podcasts. Zach Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers democracy and the far right. His latest piece is titled, "I Listened to Hours of Trump's FBI Pick on Steve Bannon's Podcast. Oh, boy." Zach, thank you for doing this genuinely important work. I guess what's first your sort of top line about what you came away thinking about the qualifications and worldview of this individual?
Yeah, Kash Patel may or may not have significant experience with government, depends on how you assess his time in the Trump administration. What he does have is a very, very paranoid worldview. I think that's probably the best word to describe it. I mean, he is constantly drawing connections between one threat and the other, an external threat to American security and whatever problem he has with the Biden administration or Democrats at the moment, all of which circles back to a kind of personal threat against Donald Trump, who he sees as really the linchpin of the American Republic, at least in the way that he talks about things on this podcast.
You're right. The overwhelming impression is that Patel's a man whose entire worldview revolves around paranoid conspiracy theories, specifically conspiracies against both America and Trump, which for him are one and the same. I thought this was a really interesting observation. I'm reading the Beverly Gage Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of J. Edgar Hoover right now, in some ways prompted by what's going on. He says it's a specific kind of obsession that reminds me of the FBI's first director, J. Edgar Hoover, a man who infamously abused his power to persecute political enemies. Tell me more about that.
So Hoover had basically built his worldview after this kind of fear of post-World War II fear of foreign infiltration and of attacks on American soil. He was worried about, for instance, kamikaze attacks happening inside the United States after what had happened on the Pacific Front during the war, and he believed the Soviets are responsible. And this sense that the Soviets were infiltrating American government in order to execute these actual kinetic plots against the United States, in addition to whatever else the Soviets wanted to do, really defined what Hoover was concerned about and led him to see Soviet agents basically anywhere. And what Patel does is there's no one overriding threat like the Soviets, but he strings together a few different enemies, right? China at some points, Iran at other points, sometimes even, drug dealers bringing people across borders. And all of them are linked back in varying ways to the Democratic Party and domestic enemies, right? So you play that clip of him talking about China funding Biden. There's no real evidence for this, right? Like his argument is a report, I believe, I tried to trace it back, that House Republicans had put out that suggested maybe there had been some foreign money going through Act Blue, the Democratic crowdfunding platform. That's not really good evidence to say China is funneling money to the Biden campaign. But it's important for him to make this argument because it creates a justification to be able to say, when I go after them as FBI director, right, it is different from when they went after me, which is what he believes happened when the government was under Biden's control.
Yeah, I want to play two clips here. One is about using the sort of model that he used when he was a staffer on the Intelligence Committee to essentially fight this media war through leaks and use of official documents that he says he wants to sort of export as a kind of model for fighting back against Trump's enemies. Take a listen.
This is how we won Russiagate. We not only used Congress, we used the White House. We used the power of educating the American public with the corruption author's own documents from FBI and DOJ. And it can be done. Steve, just think about that. We did that at one place, in the FBI, mainly, and a little bit of DOJ. Just think about what you can do if you do it all at once at DOD, at the CIA, at the NSA, at the DOJ, at the FBI, at Treasury, at State, and the list goes on.
Basically, the idea of using government documents in your possession for official purposes as a tool of essentially selective leaking for propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, his view is that the domestic enemy is literally the enemy, right? That there's not a meaningful distinction in many ways between a foreign threat and a domestic one. And so when you take that view, when you believe, you know, he wrote a book that he called Government Gangsters. It's called Government Gangsters. He's hawking it all the time on these podcasts. And the argument of the book, it's very literal, right? The American government is a kind of mob operation that is directed at Republicans and Donald Trump that's designed to entrench its own power and keep the deep state in power personally. He even has a literal enemies list in the appendix of the book where he lists 50-odd people who he believes are part of this nefarious group of government gangsters, the deep state. And Patel believes that they have weaponized the state against Republicans, and the only way to fight back is to weaponize the state against them, right? And that doesn't mean, you know, playing by the rules or within the normal legal bounds. It means doing whatever you need to do in order to make sure you win the political war.
There's another clip where he sort of promises to go after the media, whether civilly or criminally. This one has gotten a fair amount of attention. A threat I think I take literally, although this is clearly someone who wants to be a media figure. Give him like a 4 or 5 out of 10 as a broadcaster, but not terrible. Zach Beauchamp, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris.
I feel like Trump would like nothing more than to head fake Ron DeSantis. You know, Matt Dowd, humiliating his sycophants is his favorite game. And now that 4 sources are out there saying talks with DeSantis are in their advanced stages, it does feel like this is treated as a shameful and unserious game on the part of Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, he likes to head fake and dump anybody in the grease as quickly as he can, and then, you know, he thinks that it shows his own sign of power by embarrassing people and causing people to grovel, and then, you know, slink away in the course of this. I mean, going back to our conversation, you know, this whole thing has become seedy, and just the way Donald Trump is putting these people and their families in the public eye, and then just basically backing away, and not that he won't defend them, because Donald Trump in the end only cares about himself, as we all know in the course of this. And so anybody that doesn't serve a purpose at some point, he's not going to stand full scale behind him, which is kind of amazing for a commander in chief and a Defense Department nominee that you're not willing to stand behind. I mean, that kind of is a telling sign of Donald Trump. But I agree with what was said about that statement. To me, I've seen 100 of those statements, and the next statement you see is, I can't support this guy. That's usually the first one. We had a thorough conversation, and the next thing you hear is Joni Ernst has problems.
So again, we don't know what's going to happen. I do appreciate everyone refusing to get ahead of the story. One of the things that has happened, though, is that 4 sources close to Trump have floated DeSantis. Let me just show you a little bit of what Trump has said he thinks about Ron DeSantis.
Ron DeSanctimonious has the poll numbers of a wounded bird falling from the sky. Somebody like Ron DeSantis cannot do it because he's owned and controlled by the globalist establishment who always puts America last.
They keep saying, oh, I think DeSantis can do okay with farmers. I don't think so. Based on polls, he's not doing okay with anything. The problem with Ron DeSanctimonious is that he needs a personality transplant, and those are not yet available.
Maybe RFK Jr. is working on that. That's where we are.
Well, I think that Governor DeSantis would most likely have a much easier time getting confirmed than Pete Hegseth. I'm glad I wasn't in the room when the governor had to do whatever groveling he had to do to even win back the favor of the president-elect.
Well, he probably had to give Lara Trump. I mean, I know they don't play three-dimensional chess, but this one's kind of hanging right out there before our faces.
Yeah, I mean, listen, obviously, elections do have consequences, and they just there are other issues with Governor DeSantis, and it's not just that he happens to be more conservative than I am personally. I think that his policy in Florida and his remarks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about Black Americans, about gay Americans should give people pause when you think about him leading the American military, which is an extraordinarily diverse institution. And that is not something that we do to be nice. That is, I think, Paul will tell us that is something that makes the country stronger from a military perspective. There's evidence behind that. And so I think, some serious questions should be asked of Governor DeSantis about just how he intends to run the military from that perspective, especially. He is a veteran. He would make a lot more sense in many other ways in terms of character than Pete Hegseth. But this is not encouraging to me either.
There's also kind of a diversionary tactic thing here, right? Like Gates is out of the way. He was taking all the arrows and all the attention. Then they go down to Hegseth, right? If Hegseth goes out, maybe it's Tulsi Gabbard next. But in the meantime, he's doing things like nominating a very radical person for VA secretary. He's nominating someone to head the Navy who's never been in the Navy, right? An undersecretary of defense who's got conflicts of interest potentially with defense contractors and has also never saved in the Navy. So he's flooding the zone, and he's challenging the Democrats. He's challenging the media, and he's challenging the public to see if they can even keep track. And he knows the holidays are coming. And people want to check out. They're tired of watching the news, and he wants to press his advantage. So I think these next couple of weeks are really key. People are tired. People are frustrated. Many people are demoralized. But right now is when you need to stay most vigilant, because right now, arguably, the Democrats have the most power and can still have the most influence, because the switch is going to flip big time on January 20th.
Well, we're not tired. What should we be focused on? I mean, beyond the names. I mean, why didn't you put them in order for us?
All of those. I mean, I think I just did. Yeah. I mean, I think, I talked about this earlier, but Collins at VA is equally radical. He's a pastor. He's a very religious guy. He's also very loyal to Trump. The fealty is really, I think, what we're getting in all these candidates. And they're kind of a 1-2 punch to tackle two of the biggest institutions and two of the biggest employers in America. So if you send two of these guys at the Department of Defense and the VA, you're talking about a massive piece of the federal government in terms of budget, in terms of personnel, and in terms of culture. So if I were him, I'd start with those two places too, and I'd put my guys there first and try to knock those down, because other things will be easier after that.
I mean, this idea of shock and awe, Matt Dowd, is something Rachel Maddow and I talked about, I think the first week, the week of the election or the first week after. It is something that you would hope in year 9. I think I've been covering the Trump story for 9 years now, that we would be better at, that we would be less susceptible to shiny objects and shiny balls. I feel, and I fret, and I'll fret publicly on live TV, that we're not much better at it than we were 9 years ago. What do you think?
Well, I think we're not much better, and the Democratic Party is not much better, but I think actually Donald Trump has gotten better at flooding the zone. I think he did it a little bit, and so it kind of was first confusing. And so let's say he threw 3 or 4 wild balls out, and then people are trying to struggle with it. Now he's throwing 12, 14, 15, 20 at a time in this. And I think that's why I think it's important for us to focus on the here and now, and not the sort of the hyperbole of what could happen, what might happen, but the here and now, and take them as in importance at one at a time. I think that's the Justice Department, in my view, was key because of what could have been done with it to people all across the board, including people in the media who've been critical of Donald Trump. That was done, and enough Republicans stood up. I think the Secretary of Defense is another one. I think Tulsi Gabbard being in charge of the intelligence services, in my view, is if we just sort of don't say all of it's bad, everything's bad, and he's about to do a bunch of bad things 6 months, a year from now, or whatever, I think that's when we get confused. I think we have to focus on the here and now and take it, not 20 at a time, but one at a time, and what in an importance of order of what matters. And allow us to believe that Donald Trump got elected president, and don't just oppose people just because Donald Trump nominates them. But if somebody is decent and they're conservative, more conservative, they may have different policy ideas. I think you have to limit your sort of critique to what really matters and to the really big problem in this, and take it in order.